Hello, my name is Martin Lipscomb, and today I'm talking to Professor Shaun Gallagher, Lillian and Maury Moss Professor of Excellence at the University of Memphis, USA. Professor Gallagher has held visiting and research positions at prestigious universities in England, France, Germany, Norway, and Denmark, and he is currently Professorial Fellow at the University of Wollongong in Australia. Shaun isn't, however, merely a frequent flyer. Professor Gallagher is a phenomenologist, and his work, which is often interdisciplinary in nature, forges close associations with cognitive science. Indeed, bringing phenomenology and cognitive science together, he has investigated, among much else, embodiment, self, agency, intersubjectivity, hermeneutics, and the philosophy of time. Shaun's most recent book, published in 2020 by Oxford University Press, is titled Action and Interaction. However, as sole and joint author, he has his name on the spines of over a dozen volumes. He has contributed to many others, and in addition, he has published far too many papers, and he has received far too many awards to comment on. Professor Gallagher, thank you for joining me today, and with your permission, I'd like to pick up and develop ideas hinted at in a British Society for Phenomenology podcast that you made in December 2020 with Hannah Berry and Jesse Stanier. In that podcast, you recognise that a distinction can be drawn between phenomenology in theory and phenomenology in research. Now, your interests and contributions cover theory and practice. However, in the BSP talk, you're keen to emphasise and promote phenomenology's practical implications, or to use a horrible phrase, its use value. Now, I'm not a phenomenologist. However, I am interested in phenomenology, and in my reading, it seems that a significant jump or disconnection exists between phenomenology as theory and phenomenology as research practice. Now, this type of disconnection isn't, of course, unique to phenomenology, if indeed it exists. From a very different perspective, I have some knowledge of critical realism, and there, as perhaps here, the sophistication and nuance that's explored in theory isn't always evident in concrete examples of studies that purportedly utilize this approach to understanding. Let me then ask, in your view, ideally, in phenomenological studies, how closely should research practice follow or instantiate theory? Or put another way, how closely ought theory to inform research practice?
Okay, thank you first of all for inviting me to participate in this. And it's a really good question that you're asking. I think to some extent it really depends on what we mean by phenomenological theory, because I think this could mean a number of things. So, for example, a philosopher might think that this idea of phenomenological theory is really about distinguishing between the works of the different philosophers. So Husserl versus Heidegger versus Merleau-Ponty, they each take different approaches, and you might say they might develop their theoretical apparatus in different ways. Or a phenomenologist who knows these traditions might think of it as investigating different phenomenological topics, such as intentionality or temporality or embodiment or intersubjectivity and so forth. So it might be that theory has to do with the precise thing that we're looking at. Or again, someone might think of this in terms of different theories of phenomenological method. So you see, for example, disputes between people like Van Manen and Smith and Georgi and more recently, Dan Zahavi. So there are different ways to think about theory. If we could sort of generally agree that phenomenology is an attempt to get at or to explicate first-person experience, and use that as a way to guide us, it would still then depend on the kind of research or application, I think. Whether we're doing something like experimental psychology or clinical applications in, say, psychiatry or psychotherapy or physiotherapy. There's even work in physiotherapy by phenomenologists. Or perhaps it's about qualitative studies, as of course I think you do in nursing. So it depends in some way on the kind of research we want to do. And then there are these different possible approaches. On the practical side, the idea of neurophenomenology, for example, this would be Francisco Varela's approach. And his approach was to actually train subjects, the subjects in his experiments, in phenomenological methods of first-person reflection. So he used a kind of three-part phenomenological method, which included the use of the epoche, this kind of bracketing, I mean, loosely understood. I think he loosely understood it to mean something like the bracketing of opinions or theories. Another approach would be front-loaded phenomenology, which is a term I've proposed, and Dan Zahavi and I talk about this as well. There, you're not really directly using phenomenological method, this kind of reflective method, and you're not really trying to train subjects, but you're using some insights that have been developed using those methods, using those insights to actually design your experimental study. And then, of course, there are, quite different from all of that, there are qualitative phenomenological interviews. And in some cases, I think the design of an interview regime involves instantiating some version of the epoche in the asking of the questions. But then there are other types of interviews, semi-structured interviews, where there's some version of the epoche that only comes in at the interpretation stage. And then there are variations of interview methods that may not require the epoche. Again, this kind of bracketing that goes on. And so in those cases, the questions or the interpretations are really designed in a kind of strict and predefined fashion. And so there's already, in a certain way, a kind of decision made about what it is we're trying to ask about and what categories we're going to use in order to understand the phenomenon. So there are these different types of approaches on the methodological side, on the practical side. And there are also combinations, for example, of phenomenological method and ethnographic studies, so phenomenological ethnography. There are studies, if you want to study, for example, how radiologists, for example, that's one example that's been done, how they do their job. It might be that you have to go and hang around with them for a while, talk with them, ask them about what they're doing now and what that's like, and so forth. And this applies in all kinds of different, this could apply in all kinds of different areas. The study of radiology in hospitals, or the study of architecture, or what have you. So in effect, I think what the question you're asking is very complex.
And that was a very philosophical answer. So it all depends upon researchers trying to do, the approach being taken, the context. Okay, let me try and come up with the same question from a slightly different perspective. So my first question asked about what should occur ideally. However, turning to what actually occurs, in your opinion, do some forms or versions of phenomenological theory lend themselves to research practice more readily than others? And if the answer to this question is yes, does that hint at or tell us anything of interest? When is theory translatable into methodology, methods, and when perhaps isn't it?
Okay. I think, I'm sorry to say, again, I think it depends on what one is studying. So I think this, in some way, the subject matter should determine the method that one chooses. So if you're asking, which method is the best or which one works the best, well, then I would just say it just depends on what we're trying to study. So for example, neurophenomenology obviously is not the right method for every study. There are certain limitations to that, where you have to be asking questions having to do with what's going on in the brain as well as what's going on in my first person experience. Front-loaded phenomenology, I think, has a wider scope. And then depending on design, interviews can have simply a different scope, but they still might not be applicable to all studies. So it really is a question of matching, what the subject matter is, what the phenomenon is that you're trying to understand, and what the best method might be. So let's say I want to study dance or acting. My bet is that we don't really get to the phenomenology by putting dancers or actors in a lab. You might get to something else that way, but you might not really get to the first person experience of the dancers if they're in a lab somehow. Also, I don't think that just like asking them, the dancers questions about their experience in the abstract will necessarily work. So again, in that case, you might have to hang out with them for a while, maybe listen to how they talk to one another, and maybe try a few dance steps yourself. It's really that, to me, the method that you choose depends on the type of questions you're asking, the type of phenomenon you're trying to get at, and this can vary across studies. So I don't have a general answer for you.
Okay. I'd like to stay focused on the difference between theory and research practice, but I'm beginning to wonder from your answers whether in fact these types of questions are off beam in some way. If the answer to the question about the relationship between theory and practice revolves around questions being asked in context, perhaps the demand sometimes for links between theory and practice aren't always sensible ones to require in the way that I'm imagining. Let me come at this then from another perspective. When I consider my own literature, the nursing literature, subgenre of research literature, I can locate published studies that, phrasing things politely, report upon works that, although claiming to be a phenomenology, where theory likely. How big can the gap between theory and practice be before perhaps we can no longer sensibly call a research report phenomenological? Is there a point past which the disconnection between theory and practice, research practice, is simply too large for any claimed synergy to hold?
Okay, yeah. So I've run into this this kind of issue before. So I've been on PhD nursing dissertation committees where I used to teach at University of Central Florida. And the students, I was in the philosophy department and there was a nursing school, but the students from the nursing school came to me because they wanted to do phenomenological studies. So there were two dissertations I was on, and neither of the nursing students knew the phenomenological philosophy. They had never read the classic phenomenologists, right? So as a philosopher, that's how I think you have to understand those texts first or something. But they never read those, and I gave them some things to read. But basically, they were depending on their familiarity with other studies in nursing, some of which claim to be phenomenological, but some of them, which I think really were a kind of mixed use of psychological models in interview style studies. So, for example, applying Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or using the big 5 personality traits, and then conducting interviews with patients about various things. I remember one dissertation was about a patient's use of art after recovering from breast cancer or something like that. They wanted to see, how could the responses of the patient be categorized according to these different psychological models. So I would say that those studies were minimally phenomenological in the sense that they were interested in the patient's experience and their well-being, of course. But I don't think phenomenological theory really informed the studies, and it's not really clear what was phenomenological about the methods used, except that they sort of aimed at getting at the first-person experience of the patients. Okay. I'm not sure that it's, I think these were good studies in the end, but I don't know if I would call the studies really phenomenological ones. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
Well, I think these my questions and your responses are all coming to the same issue from different sides or perhaps perspectives a little bit. Let me turn then to think about reading phenomenological works. While legitimate disagreement might exist regards the extent of comprehension that's necessary, report readers, the readers of phenomenological studies, presumably need to understand how, in what ways theory and research practice support each other. However, given the numerous versions or interpretations of phenomenology that exist, and you've already alluded to several of these, given this, can even sophisticated readers or consumers of phenomenological research reports identify when theory and practice are in or out of sync or alignment?
I think that should be possible, simply because there are just a finite number of variations here, which combine different aspects of studies. So it strikes me that in reading a report, for example, you can identify a target subject matter, right? It might be a study of the sense of time or the sense or experience of agency. So that's the phenomenon you're looking at. And then you could think that the report has been informed by a particular phenomenologist or a phenomenological view. So perhaps it's roughly or let's say narrowly about the very short-term phenomena of retention or anticipation, the sort of thing that you find in Husserl's work on temporality. Or perhaps it's more about existential issues of historicity, the type of thing that you find in Heidegger. Or if it's about agency, maybe it's purely about the motoric processes of motor control that you find in Merleau-Ponty. Or again, maybe it's about the social aspects of agency, and you might be really framing it in terms that have been developed by someone like Alfred Schutz. So once you define the subject matter and then the specifics of the approach, then you could ask a third question about what methodology is actually being used, and whether it was appropriate or what it accomplished. So someone should be able to pick up a report and see that it's targeting, let's say, the sense of agency understood in terms of bodily motoric processes, and that the methodology relied specifically on the kind of front-loaded phenomenology to inform some experimental studies. Well, that seems possible. In fact, that type of thing has been done. But one might think that if the target is the sense of agency understood in motoric terms, one could also get to it by using a different kind of method, say interviews or questionnaires. But it's probably unlikely that you would be able to get at that phenomenon using, let's say, phenomenological ethnography, because I think the scale is simply different. So things there might be out of sync. So then you'd be able to judge whether the method was really the appropriate method or not. On the other hand, if you were going to study the role of social factors in the sense of agency, then maybe phenomenological ethnography might be just the thing that you need. So I think in reading those reports, I think you'd be able to sort of see how the thing is organized across those different points.
I thought the idea of front-loaded philosophy or theory was a very nice way of putting it. Let me ask you one final question. In your view, what, if anything, is lost or left behind when theory is recruited to inform particular instances of research practice? And my assumption here is that perhaps something important about the open-endedness or playfulness, the intricacy of theory, is inevitably set aside when practical decisions about research must be made. Does that question make sense? I hope it does.
Yeah, I think first, the philosopher in me will say that, first of all, every research question is in some way informed by theory, right? And every decision that's made about your research design will open up some possibilities and will close down other possibilities. That's just the very nature of these relations between theory and practice. So that tells me that that's why there's no one study, and for that matter, no one discipline that will ever tell you the whole story, that will ever allow you to grasp the full phenomenon. So I've argued for a kind of pluralistic, interdisciplinary approach, where one particular method, method X, whatever, combined with a particular theory A, will enable some things, but method X combined with theory B might allow us to answer different questions. And then a completely different method, method Y, combined with whatever theory, will give you something else. So if the goal is to study some phenomenon, specific phenomenon, then perhaps one should, I would say, triangulate as much as possible. Use as many approaches as possible, and then see if we can tell a coherent story about it. And if not, figure out why we got contradictions. I think this is the way science works anyway. And of course, it makes it difficult. It's not that I'm recommending that each researcher has to do multiple studies using different methods and so forth, but rather it's through a kind of the communicative organization of science that you can start to put together these various perspectives on a particular phenomenon and try to generate, in that case, generate out of the practice, generate a more theoretical, allowing the practice to inform the theory and not just theory to inform the practice.
That was really interesting. Thank you very much. I wonder sometimes whether, when we're looking at I don't really like the term practice-based discipline, but it does sum up nursing, for example, practice-based discipline, where answers are required to inform action in the world. When we take up and use approaches to understanding which revel in the possibility of different answers and in conclusion, because there's always another way of interpreting, sometimes feel we don't always get that balance right, that tension between recognizing the open-endedness of the findings which are generated by these types of research approach, and our need to have conclusions that allow us to act in the world. There seems to be something in that which is problematic, I think, such as my own.
And I think there's two senses of practice here too. I mean,
yes.
One is research practice, and one is the practice of nursing, right?
Yes.
Where the practical outcome is extremely important. It could be life or death, that gets even maybe more difficult. But one's training, one's expertise should allow insight and kind of an intuitive sense of what to do. There are phenomenological studies of expertise and how that works, and that might be more of a topic that relates to the nursing practice itself, as opposed to doing research in nursing or research in any field.
Shaun, thank you for your time today. I know you're very busy. I really enjoyed that conversation. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Martin. It's good to meet you, even virtually, and maybe someday we'll meet in person.
That would be good.
Okay. Cheers.